So yes, we could be sitting here talking about who's going to win what in 2025, but let's not talk about that because we've got two of the finest minds in European football discourse here. I mean, Miguel, I'm going to start with you because for me, the big shadow over 2025 is the Club World Cup. Firstly, I guess we've got to ask, especially with what players in particular have been talking about over the last 6 to 8 months, is this going to be the tipping point in the overcrowded schedule of European football?
Well, that's actually if we don't get there first with the expansion of the Champions League and the rest of the European competition. Because I think this is something that's actually underappreciated. And we're going to see it in January because for the first time, well, I suppose since in modern memory, there's going to be actual European games in January. And that is actually a huge adaptation. It's going to take a lot for players to get around. Added to that, of course, I mean, these are pressurised games. And part of the reason there's pressure is because a lot of clubs want to avoid an extra 2 games then straight after that for the playoffs. So if a team is in that situation, say Manchester City could be, then they're also in the Club World Cup. That is suddenly... And with the Club World Cup as well, it's not just that it's more games, but it's also when it happens, it would be in a rare off-season or an off-summer. And yet that potentially stretches into July. Of course, then there's the other complementary feature to the Club World Cup, especially given one of the clubs involved, which is the Manchester City charges or the hearing. The outcome will affect things. But I think you're right. The Club World Cup is kind of weighing over the game. It's really had a disruptive effect on the calendar. And I think, I mean, you mentioned how we're not really necessarily going to talk about results too much. I think it's one of those, it's a bit like when the Champions League first expanded in 1999-2000. And the first World Cup after that in 2002 was really unpredictable, basically because clubs were adapting to what this was. And I think we could see the same again and potentially some very strange results as well as a lot of political chaos in football.
Well, David, we'll get in a minute to what this could mean specifically for the players and whether Julian Alvarez and his 78 game season or whatever is something that becomes completely normal. But I wanted to go back to a point that Miguel brought up there actually about there being European games for the first time and European games that are part of the first half of the season's European games happening in January. I mean, in terms of transfer window, what is it going to be like having club execs? I mean, we talk about the burnout on players, having club execs dealing with transfers when they've got Champions League games on at the same time. And how will that be for players?
Yeah, I was going to say it's just, I think in one word it's chaos. And that's ultimately where it is from top to the bottom. And, you know, Miguel's touched on it there. It's going to be this adaptation and who adapts better to exactly these brand new circumstances. Because quite frankly, nobody knows, nobody's dealt with it before. So everybody's going into it cold, and it's going to be interesting to see who is best prepared for that and who is not prepared. So this is a completely new realm for everyone involved. It is. It's going to be a really difficult situation to navigate.
The weird thing, Miguel, is like if the Club World Cup was being placed in some different context, there's actually a lot to speak for it, isn't there, as an idea? It's just that it's come into this particular calendar. I mean, in terms of inclusivity, in terms of the game not being so European-centric as well, I mean, you could argue as well with the fact that Brazilian clubs have become more and more powerful in South America and they've come to completely dominate the Copa Libertadores, for example. You feel that maybe they could actually have a chance in this sort of competition as well. Never mind the fact that traditionally South American clubs take intercontinental competition more seriously. Let's try and strip away some of that other stuff from outside at the moment. I know we can't completely separate that, but if we take away the schedule, the load on the players and what have you, what does the Club World Cup need to show to the public to make itself at least a semi-success?
Well, I suppose this has been one of the undercurrents to it in that FIFA basically need the money to make, particularly the big European clubs, who are still the engines of commercial activity in football, to take it seriously. Now, they've managed to get that through the DAZN deal, which has actually shocked a lot of people in football. Just through the size of it, maybe given the market, there's a lot of reporting around that. I suppose as long as clubs are taking it some way seriously and we've got properly competitive games, that's part of it. I think actually the time of it might help because it is in that point in summer. People are sitting down to watch TV. A game comes on at 10:30, 11:30, and it's kind of something to watch, especially if it is free to air. So that could be an element that works out for it. But I think, in terms of kind of beyond that and the issue of a success and its future and what happens next, I think you're absolutely right. The idea of the Club World Cup, I actually quite like it. I think it's necessary. It also replaced the Confederations Cup, which was a bit of a joke. But and there's an obvious need to spread the game outside Western Europe, spread the wealth of the game outside Western Europe. Obviously, the game is universal, so that's not the issue. The issue is how much it concentrates in Western Europe. But this isn't the mechanism to do that. First of all, there's the manner it's happened, where most of football is aggravated by this, because it's all. The feeling is, and the line that's been used, is that it's Gianni Infantino and FIFA almost acting unilaterally without consulting stakeholders and just imposing this on the calendar without negotiation over the space. So that's what's really irritated people, and there are obviously valid criticisms about that. Secondly, if the point of this is to spread the wealth of Western Europe around the world, this actually might have the adverse effect and just worsen the problem. Because if we are talking about prize money to make it competitive in that way and make it attractive to the big clubs, well, I think we could see the problem that we've seen in the Champions League multiplied by 100. So one of the issues of the Champions League since its inception is that prize money has basically helped create these one-team or two-team leagues, because the teams who regularly get into the Champions League get more prize money and end up dominating. If you're a club from pretty much any of the South American leagues outside Brazil, even River Plate and Boca, if they suddenly go in and they're able to earn 50 million in a competition like this, leave alone the potential effect in, say, the New Zealand League, what's that going to do for their domestic leagues for a year? So rather than redistribution, it's very narrow distribution. And I think that's an absolutely huge issue with this competition. And FIFA haven't so far released figures about what's actually going to happen in terms of the spread of the money around the game. But then one of the big questions is how commercially viable this is actually going to be.
Yeah, I think that's something that it's an issue that clearly football hasn't managed to address at all since the Champions League came to us in 1992. So I think the idea that they're going to magically find a solution to it now seems a little bit fanciful. But actually, Miguel, while I've got you on that, could I ask about Gianni Infantino? How much does he need this to work for him on a personal level in terms of his legacy, and what are the consequences for him if it backfires? Are there any?
With the structure of FIFA, probably not, especially because the 2030 and 2034 World Cups have been sorted, and 2034 is particularly relevant in that regard because it essentially, that has now reshaped the economy of football for a decade around Saudi Arabia. So FIFA has a very financially powerful partner in that way, especially through one of its own commercial partners, is Saudi Aramco. But on the other side, to be fair, people in football actively talk about this as Gianni Infantino trophy. It is kind of wrapped up. It is now, singularly wrapped up with his presidency. And if it fails, it's kind of it is, it's a blemish on that legacy. There's a lot bigger debate to be had there. And also, it is where, given we saw with the kind of with the current World Cup process, just so much support rose in behind an incumbent president for the ideas they put forward. But there is potential fractures if a competition like this doesn't work out in the way it's anticipated, or doesn't work out commercially in the way it's anticipated, given so much of the FIFA engine is basically about being able to guarantee flows of revenue to the member associations who are the voters. So it is a circular issue in that sense.
Now, David, we talked about the fact that this huge TV deal, there having been no TV deal for a worryingly long time from a FIFA perspective, they have now got that over the line. How much of a big deal is this to be free to air? And in terms of getting the public on side with the concept of a Club World Cup, how important is that?
They needed to get eyes on it. They need everybody seeing this. So they needed to find a way. I know they looked at a deal with Apple as well, but it was DAZN who came through in the end. And of course, with all the Saudi links that are there in terms of the Saudi Premier League, Live Golf, also being shown in DAZN, we can see the clear links there and the involvement that they're going to have from start to finish here, and with any future, Saudi sport that happens to take place as well. So we've seen that in terms of how that's happening and where they go from here with that in terms of how it's going to be produced, what sort of package they're going to have with it, and what people are going to see will be interesting to see. So even comes down to basic things, presenters, production, anything like that. It's going to need to be glossy. It's going to need to be good for to bring those viewers in, and it's going to have some kind of like a unique selling point, I think, for people, because I'm of the opinion if people are watching these games, it's going to be late in the night or anything like that. Miguel touched on it as well. There's going to be games late on and such. Then people's going to need a reason to watch these games. Look, they might just at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night, they might go, I just want to throw in a movie. I just want to throw in a TV series. I think this could be the tournament where you say this is where we reached the saturation point. It's been talked about, bubbles burst and saturation points for a number of years. This could actually be it, and it goes back to again Infantino with his legacy. He needs to make this a success for that. He's either going to be remembered as the man who kind of revived football, brought a bit of life back into it, brought something new, or he might well be remembered as the man who killed it off to an extent.
But isn't that one of the issues, though? I mean, football doesn't need to be revived. It doesn't need something new. What it needs is redistribution, and this isn't really the mechanism for that. I think the point on saturation point is actually key, and that is reflected in the offers they got. I mean, I know it ended up working out with DAZN, but again, they're from what everyone has said around kind of TV markets around Europe, around even America, there hadn't been many high offers until then. And I suppose, again, you can't... It's going to be interesting what crowds are like, and it's going to be interesting what audiences are like. And I think the saturation point... Because one of the issues of football, and I suppose this has been a theme of 2024, particularly around the Euros. I think it's obviously going to get worse in 2025, given what we're talking about, is every game is built up as big, and there's one every week, which means nothing feels big. It's just kind of this. It's just endless content. And I mean, yes, look, we're here because we love the game, but at the same time, the game still needs to be smart about how it actually uses itself.
Yeah, it has to feel special, doesn't it? And I guess that's the difference, that it might not you might not have that feeling going forward. But David, I know you watch a degree of South American football. Of course, this is a European football podcast, but when we're talking about the balance of maybe not money, but certainly power and media eyes, how could this work in terms of maybe redistributing the balance of interest globally? Because I think you look at these intercontinental competitions, of course, in different form. It's traditionally been, certainly in the last 20, 25 years, that South American teams take it much more seriously. And we've seen that with shock results in previous intercontinental cups, with Brazilian teams in particular doing well. We're talking about the strength of the Brazilian game and how that's manifested itself in domination of the Copa Libertadores. How important could it be globally for Brazilian teams in particular to do well at this tournament? And could that affect the result? We're maybe expecting PSG and some of the bigger European teams, Bayern, to hit hard. But are they prepared for how seriously the South American teams are going to take this?
Potentially not. I think we've seen it before. I think previous edition Club World Cup, 20 editions, I think you had 16 winners from Europe. You had another 4 from South America as well. And in South America in recent years, we've seen more money going into the Brazilian domestic game as well. You're seeing better players go to that league. You're seeing some older stars go back, but who have still can offer a lot. And I think we might even see that come around this now as well. We might see some Brazilian players who are maybe in their late 20s in Europe right now say, we might head back to Brazil now because there's so much prestige involved. We've just seen Palmeiras. They've just signed Facundo Torres from Orlando City as well. That was a club record fee. So the money is there in the Brazilian game to strengthen their teams. It comes down to strength in not only quality what you've got in your 11, but also that depth as well. That's why we've seen teams like Chelsea get, I think there was a bit of scorn at the start when we saw how many players that they were buying. And whereas now, I think a lot of people are going, all right, they've actually been sensible here. They're going to have to rotate. And this is potentially what, people have to do, clubs have to do moving forward, is they're going to have to really build their squad depth up even stronger, as well as with quality as well.
I said we weren't going to talk about the results. Before we leave this, I feel I should ask both of you, who's going to be the team to win the Club World Cup in 2025?
I'm gonna go for. I think I'm gonna go for a Brazilian team. You know, why not? Why not? Why not shake it up a little bit? Yeah, I might say Palmeiras to win this.
Okay, Miguel.
Real Madrid are going to take it very seriously because they'll be obsessed with winning it, being the first club to win it in the same way they're the first to win the European Cup. So I'm going to go for Real Madrid.
So let's go on from concepts to clubs and teams. Well, it's kind of concepts as well. I want to talk about how clubs might be affected by the, I guess, metamorphosis of the transfer market. We've seen clubs have a closer eye on the bottom line, on the balance sheet. We've seen PSR affect the Premier League, financial fair play affect other teams. We've seen the likes of Real Madrid be a little bit more prudent in recent years. Miguel, do you expect the transfer market to reinflate in 2025, or is what's happening now just the norm going forward?
No, because I think football generally in Europe is still really adjusting or accommodating to the effects of the pandemic, which is amazing to say now with 3 years on, mercifully, or 3 or 4 years on. But that was how profound an effect it was. There's still not much money in the European market. Certain clubs can do business, yes, they'd prefer to do in the summer. But also most clubs in that sense are dependent on the trickle down from the Premier League's impact. But the issue of the Premier League now is exactly as you say, PSR, where a lot of clubs actually would want to spend, but they don't have much PSR headroom. So the only way I think it gets busy in January is if there's a major sale that triggers everything. That isn't impossible. But again, if we look, say 3 clubs want Zubamendi from Real Sociedad. They're all in England, of course. He doesn't want to move in January. He'd prefer to move in the summer. Man City are one of those who want him. They are one club with a lot of headroom because of some of the movements they've made over the past 2 years. But on the other side of that, who's going to move to Man City right now with the uncertainty of the hearing? It is a huge potential variable there. So I don't want to say it'll be a quiet market because there is a potential that someone does something and open up. But at the moment, it's going to take a big move for it to open up. And then, of course, we've got the other side of it, I suppose, which is, you touch on a little bit. There's the potential implications or the potential consequences still to be seen from the Diarra case and whether something comes to that. There is a growing bedrock of legal precedent now that is, I suppose, waiting to be tested.
Yeah, before we go on to Diarra, I did want to talk a little bit about Manchester City and their role in this, David. It's really about, as Miguel was saying, big sales unblocking things for the other club. All of a sudden, providing other clubs with money that they can spend. There is a trickle-down effect in that sense in the transfer market. Because Manchester City have this climate of uncertainty, does this threaten to block the whole market in January in particular? And does it need one player, I suppose, to take a leap of faith, whether it be a Bruno Guimaraes or anyone else, and make that move to Manchester City to get the whole thing moving?
I think so. Bruno Guimaraes, Alexander Isak, somebody like that moving on. It's like Miguel's just said there, it will take one knock on one, which everything will trickle down. I really can't see any business in January happening, to be honest with you, at all. I just think everything's kind of, unstuck at the moment. And we'll in the summer, I think it'll be far different. I think we'll see a lot of movement there. I think we'll see a lot of changes. I think what's happening at Liverpool is going to have a big effect as well in terms of, Miguel's talking about headroom on wage bills and what have you. What happens if they were to lose maybe 2 of their 3 players out of Van Dijk, Salah and Trent? That could be, again, another impact that gives them a lot of wiggle room. They might go, all right, we need to spend big to replace these players. We might need to spend young if we want somebody long term. So there's that impact as well. But in terms of January, I think it's really difficult to see anybody moving on. And I think you're just in that case as well, where there's a lot of players about still at clubs on their books and in really nice wages on really long contracts. And they just might drag their heels in and just stick around.
I guess that's the question as well, really, David. The fact that really I can't think of a transfer window other than the one at the start of this year. When you look at the load on players and when you look at the visible effects of that load on players, it's clear that some teams, some clubs need to go out there and give themselves greater depth. So does it have to be like it was in Italy post Calciopoli, where they find ways to be a little bit more inventive in the transfer market to make those deals happen through other means.
Yeah, it's exactly what we said at the start of the call in terms of, how they rotate squads and what have you. Everybody's going to be adapting to this brand new world, as it were, of this huge competition just coming in to everybody's life. So that's going to have to, be navigated around as well. And I do just see more stockpiling of players on long deals, younger players as well. And then people putting, different teams out 3 times, if they've got 3 games a week, we're talking about different teams, 7-8 changes per game. I could see that becoming more commonplace as well. The negative of that is potentially you lose a bit of rhythm, you lose a bit of flow in teams, in games as well. They're starting, I'm playing with alongside 5-6 different players this week, and it's hard for them to build up some adaptation.
Now, we briefly touched, Miguel, on the Diarra ruling. Of course, this was off the back of him not being able, after he left Lokomotiv Moscow in 2014, to get a move to Charleroi because he couldn't get an international transfer certificate of FIFA. So FIFA have talked about, as they would, of course, put out a statement saying we're doing a thorough review of all our transfer rules, etc. Will this recalibration of the transfer market happen in time to have an effect in January, or is this something that could be a real story of the summer?
I think it's something that's going to go on for a few years, to be honest. It's more kind of ingredients put in place now. But I mean, what's amazing about that is when the Diarra ruling happened, they were very keen to say, only minor changes, nothing much to see here, on we go. Well, if that's the case, why then have they followed with a review of the entire structure and a missive to all the stakeholders? I'm told that actually behind the scenes they're much more nervous about this than maybe has been let on. FIFA would deny that, but again, as I say, why have this message to so many stakeholders in football? And I think that's one of the more interesting stories actually generally of 2025. I mean, it's not necessarily a good thing, but like in 2024, we saw an increasing move from football from the pitch into the courts. So the courts sort of became this arena for a lot of the game. And over the case of a year, going back towards the end of 2023, to be fair, with the Super League case, Diarra, the agents case, obviously the City APT case, that does have an impact on wider European football as well. And that created a lot of judgments. And one of the consistent trends of all of those judgments was criticism for FIFA and UEFA's current role. Not that it's obviously there was an acceptance of the need for football to be regulated properly, and it was interesting. It was always all these judgments always came out on the side of football needs solidarity, it needs redistribution, it needs competitive balance. But the criticism was basically for FIFA, UEFA, not necessarily fulfilling their role in properly overseeing that. And I think one of the most interesting things about 2025 is there's a lot of these various different legal judgments all there at once, essentially waiting to be taken on by someone. Could be the Super League again. Could be other actors in football, and that's where we could see the start of potentially huge ructions of the game. And it's where stories like the Club World Cup, the calendar, the economic power of the Premier League, it's where they all come together in that. Whether the system can hold, not to paint that 2025 is going to be a doomsday year in that sense, but football has been extraordinarily lucky for pretty much its entire existence that it has avoided the problems of cricket, of boxing, and it has this universal pyramid that for most of its history has worked very well, especially when we saw proper variety in who won the trophies. But the latter has started to change, and I wouldn't be surprised that if one long-term consequence of that is it leads to the structure changing.
And that is right, I think, to talk about all these issues being interlinked. And that kind of takes us back, David, to on the pitch, really, because there's no escaping the calendar, the effect it's having on players. I wanted to ask really what we're expecting tactically in 2025. Are we expecting any changes? And in terms of the sort of football that's played, we've seen in major international tournaments in recent years it being considered, well, more than recent years, actually, recent generations, you could argue, best practice being sort of conservative, sort of wait and see football. Even if you go back to 2010 and the way that Spain played in the World Cup, it seems about possession as protection, conservation of energy. Is this something that we're likely to see a little bit more of in 2025, do you think, as teams and squads and coaches look to make the best of this workload?
Yeah, exactly. I think, look, one of the biggest criticisms, I think, in football right now, in terms of the way it's played, is there's too much structure. The team's too confined by robotic systems. Players, individuals aren't allowed any, or they're not encouraged to show freedom of expression. So it might be that, I mean, on the face of it, that's how it looks. You think, okay, they might play a more, an energy-saving system. They can sit back in teams and just be reactive and not proactive. So that's definitely something that could happen. I'd absolutely love the complete opposite to happen in it's a case of where managers and coaches are kind of say, right, okay, you just go out there and we'll play with a bit more freedom this tournament. How serious are we really taking this tournament? And there'll be some teams like Real Madrid, Atletico Madrid, very top end teams who will be probably taking it very seriously. Others might just go, right, okay, this is a good chance for us to just show up, show a few things. As we've seen in some international tournaments as well. I remember Sao Paulo's Chile really well and such, who just turn up, and there was Peru as well, of course. So we could see teams come into these tournaments and be like that.
I guess that's the question, really, isn't it? Which way is it going to go from the effects that are undoubtedly happening in the game? I mean, I think I have to ask you as well, David, about Man City and Guardiola. At the time of recording, Manchester City are having an unprecedented, terrible run. Guardiola is, well, by the time you're listening to this, I don't know, he might have left for all I know. But they're talking about, and he's talking about having run out of ideas almost. That was one of his quotes after the Manchester derby, wasn't it? I mean, if Guardiola's Manchester City start to fall apart, and that's before we even get to all the charges hanging over the club at the moment, we see it not just in teams all over the world playing club football, but even on parks where you see people playing Rondo. You see it in League 2 as well. Guardiola has had a profound effect on international football culture. If that starts to run aground, do coaches start to look at the game in a slightly different way and maybe trust their own instincts a little bit more?
Yeah, of course, football works in cycles, so I think we potentially are on the horizon of a change. I mean, we saw Russell Martin be sacked by Southampton. One of the main criticisms of him is, why is he playing that way with those type of players, that level of players and those players with that ability? So it's, again, a lot of people's going to be watching on there and saying, like, why are we trying to do that? We need to be first and foremost just going for, how we can win, not this, put too much emphasis on style. Absolutely. If you've got the quality, if you've got the ability, you've got the individuals, then okay, then you can attempt certain things. But I think there's a case right now completely down the football pyramid. I watched some non-league the other week. I watched non-league, League 2 and Championship and Premier League, as well as European football in the past couple of weeks. And it's just incredible how many teams just continue to want to play out the back, no matter whether it's Egham or Real Madrid. They are all wanting to try and do this, and it's incredible to see. And I was even speaking to somebody who coaches kids at local football level, and he said there's some coaches there with clipboards and iPads and what have you like that to show them, well, this is how we should be playing out the back. So this is how, honestly, this has had that big of an impact. It's not just Guardiola influence a Russell Martin or a manager in La Liga or Serie A. It's also to every single level, to every single extent. And yeah, again, people's going to have to start and do something different, and that's exactly what Pep hinted at. Whether he has the energy to be that man to kind of change things around again, I'm not too sure. It might be on somebody else to do so.
Yeah, I'm sure that'll cheer Russell Martin up this Christmas anyway, being mentioned in the same sentence as Pep Guardiola. But Miguel, if we were looking at a coaching style of the present/future, maybe a dominant coach of the present/future, Xabi Alonso had an incredible 2024. 2025, he could end up as Real Madrid manager for all we know. That would not enormously surprise me. I think he's quite interesting because he's a coach who has not been someone who in the more traditional coachy way sort of trumpets his philosophy from the rooftops and says, this is my brand, these are my ideas, this is the way the game should be played. I think the interesting thing about him is how he gives that responsibility to the players, because I think he's sort of at the vanguard of some interesting young coaches who talk not necessarily about a tactical structure, but of creating a base for players to interpret the role as they see fit and sort of empowering those players, which in a way, I suppose, goes back to Rinus Michels and Johan Cruyff and total football, where so much of it is misunderstood. It's like football is spoken about as if football is played on rails, where it's not at all. It's about players being free to use their skills in different situations and interpret those in different situations. I think you can see with the way a lot of defensive midfielders now are not 6'2" guys who belt opposition players up in the air, but guys who are comfortable in the ball. We've seen like Felix Metscher, for example, be repurposed for Borussia Dortmund like that because he's so comfortable on the ball, and a bit like Toni Kroos is good at getting himself out of tight situations with a mini dribble. That idea that Alonso has of giving players the responsibility and not making it all about the cult of the coach, is that something we could see more of in 2025?
I'd go so far as saying it's the next split in football tactics. And it's where it's really interesting, I think. I mean, look, the last split was essentially Guardiola football against Mourinho football. I mean, that's quite simplistic, but it's what it was. And it wasn't even a split because really that was Guardiola coming into that early world of periodization, mostly about kind of rigid defensive structure that was kind of, I suppose, best exemplified by two of the leading Champions League coaches, that Mourinho and Rafa Benitez. Control, they used to always call it. Now, of course, the irony being, it's nothing like the control that Guardiola has asserted. But out of that, and out of kind of what Guardiola's attacking systemization did, which you're talking about possession, pressing, and positional play, with the latter being key, for a decade, I think that was obviously not just the most advanced form of tactics, but also because of what it could produce going forward, essentially the best iteration of football. It wasn't always perfect, but it was ultimately about imposing your game in the opposition, in contrast to what we saw before. And now it feels like that's reached a tipping point. And one of the common criticisms of football now, and you hear this a lot within the game, Johnny Northcroft actually did a really good piece in the Sunday Times about this around mid-December, where it's that style of football seems to have gone so far, it is almost eroded individualism not out of the sport entirely, but you hear this from coaches all the time. So many players are basically they can be drones. Managers can, if they can press and do the basics, a lot of managers can get by because that's what they need to implement the system. And something has been lost in terms of individualism, in terms of ingenuity. And as you've touched on there with Alonso, I wonder, is this the way it goes next? And is this the split? Because look, we're in Guardiola's world now. No matter what happens going forward, every single coach will play some of Guardiola's principles. The issue is more on how far down the spectrum you are. So Slot, like, it's interesting, for all obviously the natural fear about when Klopp left Liverpool. I had one chief executive last summer, slightly to my surprise, even though I obviously rated Slot, but they literally went, this guy is the best coach in the world. But obviously it's also the best coach in terms of, or potentially the best coach in terms of a very specific interpretation of Guardiola's ideology. And you would say over very far towards Guardiola's own interpretation, if with his own personal touches. Whereas Alonso is much further down. There's a lot more individualism around it. Yes, we're still talking about creating combinations throughout the pitch, but it does allow for much more personal interpretation. And is this going to be now in the same way we saw Mourinho, Guardiola? Are we going to see something along the lines of Slot, Alonso? Not that obviously many great managers coming through, but they potentially represent two of the main schools going forward, which of course is all the more interesting if it is that, because it's there'll be the kind of the narrative of Liverpool having gone for one over the other.
So there we go. Plenty of different things to look forward to in 2025. Plenty more discussion to be had with David, with Miguel, with me, and with the rest of us on the continent. Thank you for listening to On the Continent. As always, make sure you join us again tomorrow for another special edition of OTC, and make sure to subscribe in your podcast app so that you never miss an episode.